It is Wednesday, April 20th here in Draft Shark Studios in Rochester, New York. Welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Matt Schaff. With me, as always, is Jared Smola, and we brought a special guest on today to help us preview the other half of this year's offensive rookie class. Jared and I hit the QBs and running backs on last week's pod. Today, it's the wide receivers and tight ends. Before we get rolling, though, let me remind you that you can find oodles of prospect scouting reports now on DraftSharks.com. Today's spotlight is on Khalil Shakir, a player I know I've been antsy to read more about, so I'm looking forward to getting a chance to read that one. He is prospect number 32 in our totally free series, so check out every one of those with still more to come as we're just days away from the NFL draft. We'll see whether Shakir comes up in today's discussion, of course, because it is wide receiver day, it is tight end day, and joining us is the creator of WalterFootball.com, which has been online just about as long as fantasy football itself has. Walt Cherepinsky, thanks very much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, guys.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit about WalterFootball.com.
Yeah, so I made it in 1999. It was a class project in high school, and my teacher said, just keep rolling with it. So I did, and it was a hobby for a while, and then I decided in college I wanted to do journalism. And then I eventually turned this into my full-time job. So I've been doing it since 1999. We cover everything in the NFL. We do mock drafts. Charlie Campbell and I, Charlie's our senior NFL draft analyst. We both have mock drafts updated every week. We have fantasy rankings. We have picks against the spread. We grade every free agency signing and trade. So yeah, we have tons of content on walterfootball.com, and everything's free. So, if you haven't heard about it, come check it out.
Walter Football was one of the first places I remember going to read mock drafts on the internet. And this was, well before every person out there had a mock draft. There were, very few to find out there. And Walter Football, I remember, is one of the first places I remember reading those. I used to love it.
Yeah, thanks. I think we did our first mock draft in 2001. When I first started the site, it was in 99. It was just picks and power rankings. And then, kind of fell in love with the NFL draft. So, it's I think this is our 21st year doing NFL draft coverage.
Yeah. Have you seen the mock draft realm develop since then? Because I was in on that early time too, where it wasn't, they weren't quite so prevalent. So talk about like how it has changed since you guys started doing those.
Yeah, I mean, there weren't that many mock drafts when we first started. And I think like the peak was probably like 2014, 2015. I felt like everyone had a mock draft at that point. We have a mock draft database on the website where we just list everyone's mock drafts across the web. And I think that like those 2 years, we had like 500 mock drafts in the database, which is insane. It's gone down a little since, probably just people getting tired of doing mock drafts because it's so hard to predict the NFL draft. So I think we have like more than 100 in there right now. But yeah, it's definitely gotten way more popular than it was when we first started.
I know for me personally, once everybody was doing it, I was like, I don't really feel so much like doing it now that everybody's
right.
got a mock draft. But are there any other features like draft features that readers particularly gravitate to? Are people still as interested in reading the mock drafts, do you find, as they used to be?
Yeah, the mock drafts are still our most popular segment of the website. So people still are definitely into that. They're just not as into making their own mock drafts, but they still like to read them. We do NFL draft grades. So after every pick, we grade each player, and that's really popular during draft weekend. And the picks against the spread has gotten way more popular too. I think with betting being more prevalent, people are just more into like betting coverage. So people like that more. And we do some NFL draft props as well, which we're going to do next week. We don't have those up yet, but I've started looking at those. So I think I like some of them.
Yeah, we still can't bet props in New York. I have no idea why, but I've been waiting for some reason. No NFL draft props in New York State.
Maybe someday we'll prove that we're responsible enough to take on that new thing, Jared.
All right.
So we came here primarily today to break down this class of wide receivers and tight ends, obviously looking at it from a fantasy angle, but, part of it is just figuring out who's going to be a long-term good player in the NFL and what types of players we're looking at. So let's start by looking through the wide receivers that have risen to the top of this class. And we've come to a fairly good consensus of 5 that seem likely to go in round 1. So, Jared, you're our wide receiver guy. Why don't you decide the order in which we go through these guys and who we start with?
Let's start with the guy who I have at the top right now. It's Drake London. Walter, what are your thoughts on London? Actually, can we start with this before we get into the prospects? I just want to know what your process is when evaluating wideouts or really any position. Like, do you lean on tape? Do you lean on college production? Is it a 50-50 split of both? How do you go about evaluating all these incoming rookies?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is what you said. Also, I mentioned Charlie Campbell before. He talks to a lot of people in the NFL. I don't understand how he talks to so many people, but they give him the feedback and they say, "Hey, we think this guy should be a lot higher." Charlie sends them their mock drafts and they're like, "Hey, this guy should be a lot higher. We're not too keen on this guy." So we also get a lot of feedback from teams as well, what they think about prospects. And it's so funny how, sometimes teams are just so different on prospects. Not a wide receiver, but an example I would say is Deshaun Watson, where like the Texans obviously loved him and the Chiefs did too. But we talked to one team in the NFC that had a 3rd round grade on Watson. So like these teams are just so like bipolar on these prospects. So, but what we do as well, like I said, we get a lot of feedback from teams too.
That's the kind of insight that I love these days because, a lot of us at this point can look at what's going on with all the mock drafts. You can consolidate them and check one of the databases and get a pretty good idea of where these guys are likely to go heading in. But we don't really learn what the NFL thinks of the players until the draft happens, except for, guys like that who are plugged in, who can talk to folks in the league who have that kind of insight.
Yeah, and even if you think about it, even the NFL draft only tells us the highest some team was willing to take this guy. It doesn't tell us, what the rest of the league felt about any specific player. So Drake London, he feels like a guy who the NFL might be kind of split on. I know there's the whole contested catch debate, should be dock guys who do a lot of that because they're not creating separation. I see enough separation ability in London's film. I mean, he's obviously going to win in the contested catch department. For the most part, he's a former basketball player and plays football like that. What are your thoughts on London? Where is he in your wide receiver rankings?
Yeah, Drake London is he's someone who's fallen recently just because he hasn't been able to work out. Charlie just posted a stock report having him down early. The Lions like London a lot. They saw him as the next Mike Evans. And, Mike Evans, I believe, went 7th in his draft, but this is a weaker draft class. So it kind of makes sense to take a Mike Evans type of player at number 2. But he hasn't been able to work out. So I have him now going number 18 in my mock drafts to the Eagles. So I think he's going to go like around the teens. But if he were healthier, I think there's a good chance he would be the first receiver off the board. Although you could say that about Jameson Williams too. So it's kind of this draft class is kind of disappointing overall because you have a lot of players, not just the receivers, who have like some sort of issue, like either off the field or injury. Drake London's one of those guys who's going to fall a little bit because he's banged up and not 100%.
Yeah, it was a broken right ankle for London, so I don't know. I'm not a doctor, but that doesn't seem like a long-term injury that I'm worried about. Have you heard, do NFL teams like London as an outside receiver or more as a big slot guy? Because he was a slot receiver his first 2 seasons at USC and then shifted to the outside this past year.
I think he could play anywhere. He's just so talented. I feel like you could use him all over the field. And I like he's just a great prospect. And you're right. I mean, the ankle isn't that big of a deal, but the fact that he hasn't been able to work out, like teams just don't have the measurables on him. So I don't think he's going to fall too far. He's not going to fall some of the other guys who have been injured. But I feel like London's just a great prospect.
Yeah, it seems like where something like that can hurt is when you have kind of a tightly packed group in a class like this one, where it could just be a tiebreaker if a team's high on 3 wideouts and one of them they haven't been able to get workout numbers on. Like if we look back at last year, there were questions about Jamar Chase coming off a year away from football. It didn't hurt him. He went 4th overall and then dominated in the first year. So I don't think it's going to hurt somebody if they're ahead of everybody else on everything else. So we'll see about that. I'm curious on Drake London. Dwayne Mcfarlane, I believe, passed along that London hadn't run a whole lot of the NFL routes compared to other guys in this class. So it's kind of, there's some projection on what he's able to do on that front. And I'm sure that's going to differ by team. I think that's where it's going to be interesting to see where London does go, because there have been projections inside the top 10. There have been others more lately in the late teens, like you mentioned, Walt. I'm very curious to see if he's the first wide receiver in the draft at like 7, or if he does dip to like 19.
Yeah, I mean, these receivers, I think it's a good point saying that they're so close together that it could be a tiebreaker. So yeah, I think his draft range is pretty wide. Like I said before, the Lions were considering him at 2, but they fall in love with Trayvon Walker, so they're probably going to take him. But yeah, I think you could see him sneak inside the top 10. Like I could see Atlanta at number 8. Seattle, if they trade Metcalf, number 9, the Jets at 10, like he could go that high, or because he hasn't been able to work out, maybe he falls because the other receivers rise. So I have him number 18. That feels like the bottom though. Like I don't see him falling past the Eagles really.
Mm-hmm.
If you had to guess right now, who do you think will be the first receiver off the board?
I think it's going to be it's so close. It's either Garrett Wilson or Jameson Williams. I think if Williams were healthy, I think he would be the first receiver off the board. So it really depends on how teams feel he is coming off the torn ACL. In my mock draft, it's one pick apart. I have Garrett Wilson going 10 to the Jets, and then Williams going 11 to Washington.
Have you and Charlie found anything in talking to teams that does the league think differently about ACL tears now than it used to? I mean, obviously in general, it's easier to come back from now, but does it maybe worry a drafting team a little bit less now than it used to have a prospect coming off that injury?
Yeah, I think it definitely it's definitely less impactful than it once was. I mean, it's still a concern. Like if Williams were healthy, he would probably be in the conversation number 4 or maybe even number 3 to the Texans. I think he's that good. So I think he goes like between 8 and I want to say 15. I think that's his range. So it hurts him a little bit. But yeah, I think teams are definitely less scared of guys coming off the sort of injury.
And Jared, you're similarly high on Jameson Williams, right?
Yeah, I mean, he's the most exciting. He's the most fun receiver to watch in this class, just because of that speed. I think the best word for it is unnatural speed. Like you just watch defenders; they're not used to seeing someone that fast. It almost surprises them when they just they take a bad angle on Williams after the catch, because they're just not used to playing against guys that fast, even in the SEC. And Williams, I think the biggest knock against him, I guess, besides the ACL, is that he did absolutely nothing in his 2 years at Ohio State, which would be a concern for me in a lot of cases. But when you go to Alabama, against the best competition in college football and put up the type of numbers he did this past season, I'm not really concerned about the fact that he was just a 1-year producer. So as long as that knee checks out, I could definitely see Williams, kind of developing into the top receiver in this class.
Right. It's kind of like the receiver version of Kenneth Walker, where you would question him having to go somewhere else to produce, but it's not like he went to a directional Michigan school, right, Walt?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, the competition there is elite, right, in college. So I think there's really no concern there. I mean, he's just so talented. It's just the injury it's the only worry, I think.
So both of these guys seem like they should be pretty good fantasy contributors going forward. Are there any worries from either of you guys on London or Jameson Williams from a fantasy standpoint?
I guess for me, it really depends on where they land. So like for example, the Packers and the Chiefs, they both have 2 first-round picks. So if one of them moves way up for one of these receivers, you would love them in fantasy. Maybe not Williams in his first year because of the ACL. I'm always wary on taking receivers with the ACL. But that's obviously a better situation than if they go to Houston or the Jets with questionable quarterbacking. So we have to really see where these guys land. I think that'll dictate how we think about them in fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think one potential concern for Williams is he was 6'2", 179 pounds at the combine. Bama had him listed at 189, and I've heard that it might have been the rehab from the ACL. He dropped some weight, but if he's playing under 180 at 6'2", that'd be a concern. But if he can get up into that 190 range, I think it's less of a concern. It didn't, his play strength to me on tape wasn't a big issue at Bama last year.
Besides, that size is like Devontae Smith after a protein regimen.
Right.
So a couple of guys who did stay at Ohio State and produce, Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, both in this class. Jared, why don't you start helping us sort these two? It sounds like Garrett Wilson is a pretty good bet to go ahead of Olave.
Yeah, I think to me, Wilson would be my bet to be the first receiver off the board. Just seems like he's the cleanest of these prospects. He is such a dynamic mover. He's fun to watch too. He creates a ton of separation in his routes. He's really tough to bring to the ground after the catch. Put up 2 nice seasons of college production. Never actually led Ohio State in receiving. It was Olave back in 2020, and then Jackson Smith and Jigba, who looks like an absolute stud in next year's class, who kind of led Ohio State this past year. But, Wilson, considering the target competition he was facing at Ohio State, I think put up nice college numbers. Again, I think the tape is awesome. I think size is probably my biggest concern with Wilson. He's 6 foot, 183 pounds. That might put him mostly into the slot at the NFL level. Walter, what are you hearing about what NFL teams think about Wilson and kind of his projection in the NFL?
Yeah, I think that's the one concern with him is his size. He's only 6'0", and usually the receivers that go in the top 10 are like 6'2" or taller.
Yep.
But I given his great ability with, like, he's so explosive and fast. I think he still has a chance to go in the top 10. Like, the Jets seem like a great fit for him based on what they've done in the past and taking like the high upside guys. I think they would maybe take a shot on Wilson or maybe Jameson Williams, but the size is the only concern. Like, if he were 6'2" or 6'3", I think we'd be talking about him maybe being a top 5 pick. That's the only issue, though. He's a great prospect otherwise.
My comparison for Garrett Wilson is Kadarius Toney. I think they have that movement ability that's just kind of different. I've heard some Odell Beckham comparisons for Wilson. I think that's a bit lofty, but Toney is a guy that Wilson kind of reminded me of when I was watching him.
So Chris Olave, obviously coming out with Garrett Wilson doesn't help. Having Smith and Jigba there hurts his stat production as well, but he's put up big numbers at Ohio State. Seems like a lock for the first round. Over the past few years, it's kind of emerged that we need to be wary of guys who aren't early declares at wideout, but this might be a little bit different year on that front because, if Olave had declared last year, it was coming off the shortened COVID year. So that could be, altering at least a class or two here for what we can expect. Walt, what's your outlook on Chris Olave overall?
I mean, I have him going to Houston at number 13, so he's not too far behind Wilson. He's an explosive player, an amazing route runner too. I think it's a great feature for him. The worry there though is, he's 6'0", kind of like Wilson, but there's some durability concerns too with him, and maybe that's why he's going a little bit later. But he's going to be right in that range. Like these receivers we talk about, these 4 receivers, I feel like they can go in any order, basically. Although I think Olave is probably going to go after Wilson, but yeah, if some team took Olave over Wilson, I wouldn't be too surprised.
Jared, Chris Olave was the first guy in this class to really pop to me, just because at this point my college football watching is basically bowl games and the Justin Fields film last year when we were getting ready for him to enter the league. So in watching Justin Fields, I was like, ooh, I can't wait till that receiver is coming into the league. So what's your early outlook for Olave for fantasy and kind of sorting him with these other first round wideouts?
Yeah, he's such a tough evaluation for me because he broke out as a sophomore, had a massive junior season, averaged over 100 receiving yards per game as a junior, again, alongside Garrett Wilson, beat Wilson in all major receiving categories. But Olave took a step back last year in terms of, raw production, which again, you can explain away a bit by, having to compete with Wilson and Jackson Smith and Jigba. But if you look at, stuff like PFF receiving grade and yards per route run, Olave took a step back in those categories last year as well, again, as a senior. So that's sort of the tricky part with me. I'm with Walter. I think his size is a bit of a concern. He can sort of get beat up by physical coverage. And Olave doesn't offer anything after the catch. He forced, PFF had him for 9 broken tackles forced for his entire college career. So I think Olave might be the safest wide receiver prospect. He might be the most NFL ready of these guys, but I don't see the ceiling of a London or a Garrett Wilson or a Treylon Burks, who we'll talk about next. Like, I sort of think Olave is going to max out as a number 2 wide receiver in the NFL.
You see him the same way, Walt, a lower ceiling than those other guys?
Yeah, definitely. I think he has a lower ceiling. I would say I don't know if he's He's probably like I think you're right in saying he's probably one of the safer receivers. I think maybe Wilson might be a little bit safer just because Olave has the durability concerns. If he didn't have those, I think he'd probably be the safer guy. But he's definitely safer than the injured receivers for sure.
Yep.
What were the injuries? What's the durability with Olave?
Just like he's like one of the smaller receivers in the first round. He can get beat up, like you were saying. Some teams were talking about like how they don't know if he could last a full NFL season consistently. So it's not like specific injuries or anything. It's just a worry about like being in the NFL every week and getting beat up by cornerbacks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
One last note I had on Olave, because we talked about the fact that he stayed in school for 4 years, but he's only 21 years old. He's actually only a month older than Garrett Wilson, and he's actually 3 months younger than Treylon Burks. So I don't know if we go by experience, we don't like that the guy stays all 4 years, but age wise, he's right there with Wilson and Burks, and he's only like a half year older than Drake London.
Yeah, and we'll see what the COVID effect is, but I think that just in viewing this year's class, we kind of have to at least downgrade it a little bit and say we're not coming off a regular 2020 season. Even the season itself looked very different for a lot of teams. So, we'll see where it goes. Treylon Burks, you guys have each already mentioned. The last of these top five, it seems like the five that are locks to go in round one. Treylon Burks, though, has people all over the place. There are some Twitter fantasy folks who are like, this guy has the highest ceiling wide out in the class. You're crazy if you don't have him at number one. There are others who are like, why do you like Treylon Burks first in this class? He clearly isn't that guy. So I guess where is he to you guys? Jared, where's Treylon Burks for you? Closer to the top or the bottom of this top five?
Closer to the top, only because I think he might have the highest ceiling of this group, and you factor his skill set and his size. He's 225 pounds. And I see the concerns on tape. Like he doesn't create separation on the short intermediate stuff. He's at his best either working downfield. I think he plays faster than he timed. I saw him run by some SEC cornerbacks, and then he is awesome with the ball in his hands. There are comparisons, I think, to Deebo Samuel with Burks, at least as a, after catch guy. And then you look at the production. It's tough to really knock the guy too much. He led Arkansas in receiving yards as a true freshman, easily led the team in his sophomore and junior years in catches, receiving yards, and touchdowns, just massive market shares, fared really well in yards per route run, fared really well in PFF receiving grade. And even the testing stuff, I guess I think it was disappointing only because people expected more. But if you actually look at the numbers at his size, it wasn't a bad combine. He just, Burks just didn't test as a freak athlete. He tested as, just a good athlete.
Yeah, I think we always have to put these numbers into context. You can't just look at the number itself. He smoked Alabama this year. And I think he was the one who said he tries to pattern his game after Deebo. Walt, how do you feel about Treylon Burks?
Yeah, I like Burks. The concern is like the 4.55, right? I mean, he's the slowest of the first round receivers, but at 225, I mean, obviously he's going to be slower than the other guys who are 180. So I don't think that's a concern for me. I know teams have some issues with him, as you were saying, with the separation issues. Plus, they were questioning his deep speed. But I like him a lot. I mean, he's a good route runner. He's great after the catch. He's an explosive player. I think he has amazing upside. But I think he's definitely the number 5 of these 5 receivers. I was saying before, it wouldn't surprise me if Olave went before Wilson, but it would surprise me if Burks went before Wilson, for example. So I have him going to Tennessee in my mock draft. He's been around the mid-20s. For me, I've had him going to Dallas a lot. I know the Cowboys would be really interested in him. But I have Dallas going guard now, so I have him slipping to Tennessee. So I think his range is lower than the other guys. I think whereas Drake London, his floor is probably 18, 19. I think Burks' ceiling is probably around there, 18, 19, Eagles, Saints, around that range.
Okay. No, that almost makes me like him. Almost makes me like him better in fantasy because you have Dallas down there in the 20s, and that's where Green Bay and Kansas City are. Tennessee wouldn't be a great landing spot, but I think those teams picking in the 20s and 30 with Kansas City, that's kind of prime spot for a top landing spot for one of these wideouts.
Would Jerry Jones even be able to pass on a star wide receiver from Arkansas? I'm not sure.
Yeah, it'd be tough. He would have some sleepless nights if he did.
And right now, of course, we're trying to sort these guys out for their draft class. And I know you say, Walt, that you would be surprised if Burks is closer to the top of it than the bottom. Ultimately, performance-wise, though, would it surprise you if Treylon Burks ends up being the most productive of these 5 first-round wideouts?
Oh, no, definitely not. I mean, I love Treylon Burks. I just know teams aren't as high on him as like I am or other people are. But I think that was a good point made where, the later he goes, it might be better for him, like not short term financially, but if he goes to Dallas, for example, and plays with Prescott, or if he goes to Green Bay at 22 and plays with Aaron Rodgers, that would be great for his career. And I like him overall as a prospect too. So yeah, it would not surprise me at all if in the end Burks is the number 1 receiver in this class.
All right. So outside those top 5, who do you expect, or who's most likely among these wideouts to sneak into the first round?
I also have Christian Watson. I actually have him going ahead of Burks at number 22 to Green Bay, just because it's a fit of what Green Bay has done. If you look at their past drafts, they've kind of swung for the fences. They've taken guys who, kind of like a Darnell Savage, like people expected Savage to go later. Also Rashawn Gary, like they took him a little earlier than people thought. Christian Watson is kind of the player that the Packers have drafted, just like the home run threat. And he has so much upside. So I think that he could go to Green Bay or Kansas City. I think he could sneak into the first round for sure. Maybe he could definitely go in the second, but I think that he would probably be the 6th receiver to go, either the 5th or the 6th.
What about you, Jared?
I think Watson in the first round would be a major mistake. I get the upside because he is a freak athlete, like a truly elite athlete. I think he's a major project at this point. I'd rather see Green Bay or Kansas City take George Pickens there. To me, he's outside of the top 5. He's the guy that has the highest ceiling in this wide receiver class. 5-star recruit. He was a top 5 recruit in his class coming to Georgia. Had an awesome freshman season, led Georgia in receiving as a true freshman. Took a bit of a step back as a sophomore, still had a decent season. Then he had the torn ACL that kind of cost him this past year. But if he can, recapture that freshman year form, I think Pickens is a guy who, could be like a number 1 receiver at the NFL level within the next couple of years.
Where you at on George Pickens, Walt?
Yeah, like Pickens. I mean, the ACL is definitely a concern. I know he came back from it a little bit and did well, but that is an issue for sure. So I think that might push him into the second round. But it wouldn't surprise me at all if some team took him late in the first. I think you can argue that for Watson or Dotson from Penn State. I think it wouldn't surprise me at all if you see 8 receivers going in the first round. I think it's more likely we see 6. But given how much teams have been spending financially on receivers, I think that'll push these guys up earlier than people think they'll go.
I know at least in his first mock draft, Josh Norris from Underdog had Sky Moore up at 19. I think he had him in round 1. So it's going to be interesting down around the bottom of that, top 5, top 6, end of round 1 to see what teams are valuing, especially in a class where people aren't all that excited about a whole lot. It's easier to talk yourself into a wide receiver in that range, especially when you get that 5th year on the contract to potentially control the guy if he works out. Now, I think it's not only important to look at these guys versus each other, but to try to get some context by comparing them to the past couple years' classes as well. And I think when you look at this year's group versus the past 2, it lines up pretty well. I mean, if we look at last year, obviously Jamar Chase is the top one, and it doesn't seem like we have a prospect in this class that's at Jamar Chase's level, but that is the case in most classes at wide receiver. Jamar Chase is a special prospect. Behind him, though, in round 1 last year, we had Jalen Waddle, we had Devontae Smith, Kadarius Toney, Rashad Bateman. The year before, we had Henry Ruggs, Jerry Judy, CeeDee Lamb, Jalen Reagor, Justin Jefferson, Brandon Ayuk as first-round wideouts. That seems very similar to me, Jared, value-wise, to what we have in this year's prospects. Does it look similar to you in that there's this, pretty wide group of seemingly first round worthy wideouts, not necessarily one clear standout at the top, plenty of room to pick out your favorite?
Yeah, I don't like the top of this class as much as I did either of the last 2 classes. I mean, obviously Jamar Chase kind of in a tier of his own. Even Devontae Smith, I would have had, as the top receiver if he had come out this year. I would have had him over all these guys. I do like the depth of this class better than the last couple. Like wide receivers 4, 5, 6, 7. I think I like this year better than last year. So I think, a bit deeper, but not as strong at the top to me.
Well, how do you think it stacks up versus the last 2 years' classes?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's not as strong at the top, but it's deeper than it was last year. Although 2020 was an amazing class, like not just at the top, but also depth wise. I mean, you had like Chase Claypool and then Brandon Ayuk and Michael Pittman Jr. and like all those guys. So I think if you were to grade the 2020 class as an A+ and 2021 as an A, I think this is probably like an A-. It's still a really good class, just not elite like we've seen in the past couple of years. But it's definitely one of the best positional classes in 2022. This is a pretty weak class overall. Like, for example, like Hutchinson's going to go number 1 probably. I think in a normal year, he's going to be like 4 or 5 or 6. He's not like a Joey Bosa or Nick Bosa or Chase Young. So you're going to have these receivers pushed up, I think. And that's why I was saying I think there's a chance you might see 8 receivers in the first round. This is a great receiving class overall, just not as elite as we saw the past couple of years.
Yeah, as I mentioned, 5 first-round wideouts last year, 5 more in round 2, 6 in round 1 in 2020, 7 more in round 2. To me, though, this still looks similar to that 2020 group because, if we look back on it now, Justin Jefferson looks like the, all-time stud from that class, but he was 5th off the board among wideouts there. And that, to me, kind of draws a parallel to this year's group where are Jerry Judy, or I guess were Jerry Judy and or CeeDee Lamb ahead of whoever your top 2 are in this class, Jared?
I think I would have had Lamb and Judy ahead, although they kind of be in the same tier for me as guys like Jameson Williams, Drake London, Garrett Wilson. Again, just like Jamar Chase and Devonta Smith, I had those 2 guys ahead of anyone from the last 2 classes.
Mm-hmm. All right, so we already talked about any other wideouts who might sneak into round 1 this year, and we've kind of touched on this next group as well. But Walt, some favorite day 2 and day 3 prospects, and feel free to rehash somebody that we touched on or mention any new guys that jump into this mix. Your favorite wideouts in terms of day 2, day 3 likely prospects this year.
Yeah, there are a lot of day 2 guys, and that's what I'm talking about, like the depth of this class, receiving class. We talked about Pickens already, Watson. Maybe he falls to day 2 in that case. I like him a lot as a value pick. Dotson, I mentioned. Sky Moore was discussed as well. I don't know if he's going to go as high as the 19, but you never know how teams feel about these guys. So he's a dangerous slot receiver. The size is the only issue with him, but he's looking good for day 2. Alec Pierce, he's big, he's a good route runner, and Wan'Dale Robinson is someone a couple months ago we had in the first round just because we heard from a couple of teams that they really liked him, but he's probably going to go in day 2. Just some size and durability questions, but he's a great route runner and very explosive too. So yeah, there's a bunch of guys you can like in day 2. It's looking like a great depth receiving class.
Yeah, when teams are looking for a first-round wideout, they're just going to look right over Wan'Dale Robinson's head. So that's probably his big.
That's true.
Jared, what about you?
Yeah, Robinson's so fun. I mean, if he was 20 pounds heavier, I think he would belong in the first round. But he's only 178 pounds, 5'8". He has like super tiny hands too. So size is definitely a concern.
Why are you just being
Robinson? But he's a fun player. David Bell. Have you heard anything on him, Walter, about, where the NFL is viewing him? Because production-wise, he looks awesome. The testing was really poor. I think that kind of matches the tape. There's not much juice to his game, but he got it done at Purdue. Where do you expect him to go in the NFL draft?
I have him in the 3rd round. The teams were kind of soured on him just because they think he has some separation issues and like these speed questions. And yeah, he tested very poorly. That didn't help. Kind of like in Keel Harry kind of concerns there that he's going to be that sort of player where he just can't separate from corners. But some team's going to take a chance on him in probably the 3rd round, maybe a little bit higher, maybe a little bit lower. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if he turned out to be a good receiver, just beating the low expectations teams have of him. But yeah, I think he's probably going to go in the 3rd round.
Yeah, everybody's going to cringe just from hearing the name N'Keal Harry at this point, but it's a lot easier to take N'Keal Harry in round 3 of the NFL draft than it is to take him as a first-round pick, because nobody that's a round 3 NFL draft pick and that you're taking in, late 2, early 3 of a rookie draft is truly a bust if he doesn't work out.
I got one more wide receiver name I want to ask Walter about, Justin Ross, who to me is kind of similar to George Pickens, had an incredible freshman season at Clemson, but sort of tailed off from there, and then has major medical issues. He has a back issue. I think his medical is probably the most concerning among any of these wide receiver prospects. What are you hearing from about the NFL's view on him, and where do you expect him to go?
Yeah, the medical is a huge issue. I think we did our first 2023 NFL mock draft a couple years ago, and I had him. I think I had him like number 3 overall or something. Yeah. He was so good his first year at Clemson. He just so much upside. He looked like he was gonna be a stud, and then he just kind of fell off. Like the injuries, I feel like sapped his production. So it's kind of a shame what happened to him, but he could always rebound. Like he could get healthier. Teams aren't going to draft him early because of the injury question marks. Like it wouldn't surprise me at all if he fell into the 3rd day. Like if he went like round 4 or something, maybe round 5 even, just because teams are going to be like terrified to kind of maybe waste a pick on him. Like his floor is so low. But I think eventually like teams are going to be like, okay, we just got to take a chance on this guy because he has so much potential. And like what are you really talking about? Like in round 5, like you're probably going to draft someone who's not going to be in the NFL in a couple of years. So you might as well take a chance on him. So I think he's going to go probably early day 3.
Dane Brugler had him in round 7 of his mock draft recently. So I'm very interested to see what the NFL says about, or what, one NFL team says about Justin Ross. Because I agree with you. Once you get to that round 5 range, it's like, why not? Unless you really just think that a guy is not going to ever be there again physically.
I'd like to see him in Jacksonville back with Trevor Lawrence. He could, kind of take a red shirt this year behind all those guys they've added. Then maybe 2023 be a starter there.
It still feels like sending anybody to Jacksonville is condemning them. We'll see. I hope that Doug Peterson turns that around. A couple guys that I want to throw out that could be either day 2 or day 3 wideouts. Khalil Shakir, who we mentioned already, of course, is today's prospect focus on Draft Shark. So, Jared, before I mention the second guy, why don't you tell me a little bit about Khalil Shakir and where we should expect him to go?
I like Shakir with the ball in his hands. I didn't see him creating a ton of separation in his routes, and I think you look at his size, he's probably a slot in the NFL. So a fine player. I don't see a lot of fantasy upside to Shakir, though.
Okay. Walt, what about you?
Yeah. I guess it depends where he goes. If he goes to like a pass happy team, like maybe you can argue that he could maybe turn out to be something like positive fantasy wise in a couple of years. He's got like good speed. I think he ran a 4.43. I think I kind of like him as a potential sleeper to start day 3. I think he's probably going to go around 4 or maybe around 5.
We're just going to have to subtitle this episode Separation Anxiety, I think. But along with Khalil Shakir, I got Bo Melton that has been drawing my attention through draft season. And, I think it's important to say in both of these guys, these aren't guys that I look at with stars in my eyes and I'm taking wherever I need to in a rookie draft. But I'm especially interested because we're talking about how they're unexciting and they're going to slide into draft. And Shakir and Bo Melton, to me, look similar in that they're both mixes of good college market shares, good athleticism in pre-draft testing, size that doesn't stand out, but also isn't terrible. They're bigger than Wan'Dale Robinson. And I'm really waiting on draft capital. They're kind of in the neighborhood where Tyler Johnson was for me a couple years ago, where, I probably didn't weigh in his draft capital enough after falling for him ahead of the draft, and then maybe overweighted him a little bit in dynasty drafts after that. But I'm curious, both of these guys, and again, I'm not giving up totally on Tyler Johnson, so maybe just the key is to not fall in love too much and make sure that you take in all the factors when you're deciding how to treat them.
Yeah, I haven't watched Melton yet. I will before the draft. He was at Rutgers for 5 years, didn't really break out until his 4th year there. He is a bit undersized, so yeah. Well, we'll see where he goes. I'm gonna watch him before I say anything else about Bo Melton, though.
All right, I watched the highlight video, so I'm all set on that.
Yeah, you think he's the next Randy Moss if you watch a YouTube highlight video on any guy.
Absolutely, put some music behind him and a rap song. I'm all set. He's going to be a star. Before I move away from these two players, though, let me mention player profiler comps: Khalil Shakir to Golden Tate, Bo Melton to Tyler Lockett. So that, of course, is not going to hurt my affinity.
That's what got you.
No, it was before that. I liked the stuff before I got there, and then I saw that, and I was like, oh, baby. Just give me him somewhere before round 6, and I'm in. All right. So let's move on to tight ends, and we're certainly not going to spend nearly as long on them as wide receivers because this class doesn't seem like it deserves it, even at a position that rarely deserves it. So I guess, Walt, first, who do you see as the number 1 tight end in this class? And is this class as underwhelming as it generally seems to be?
Yeah, it seems pretty horrible. I mean, like compared to last year, like if you have like Pat Fryermuth, who was the second tight end after Kyle Pitts, I would put Fryermuth like way above any of these guys. And Fryermuth went in the middle of the second round. I think there's maybe a chance that you might see one of these guys go late second, or maybe 2 of these guys. But I think there's a decent chance you might see one of these guys go in the third round, or the first guy, I should say, go in the third round. Like right now, it's pretty close between 3 guys: Trey McBride, Greg Dulcich, and Jelani Woods. I think you could order them in any order, really. I think I would put McBride over the top 2, just as I think he's safer. He's just not a great athlete, but yeah, it's pretty rough if you need a tight end this year.
Mm-hmm. I'm a little surprised McBride isn't getting more love. I mean, he put up 1,100 yards last year. Even in 2020, he only played 4 games in the COVID season, but he averaged 82 yards per game in 2020. He led all qualifying tight ends in PFF receiving grade last year. I don't know if they're probably blocking concerns with McBride, which I know we're less concerned about for fantasy football, but fantasy wise, I think he looks like someone who could definitely help. If not this season, then definitely down the road.
Yeah, it's some size issues too. He's like 6'3", 246, and he's not like great athletically. So he's like, his ceiling isn't that high. Like I think his floor is pretty high though. Yeah, he's good. He's gonna be safer. He's a good route runner. And so like I like McBride a little bit. Just if he's your first tight end in your class, like that's pretty rough though.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I mean I'm still working through these guys, but I liked what I saw from Trey McBride. I did the write-up for us on him. Dominated market share the past 2 years there, as Jared alluded to. Terrific speed for the position, even though he didn't test great otherwise. Looks good as a receiver. You kind of have to remember when you're watching him who he's playing against. It's not a great level, but he stands out as a receiver against who he's playing against. Was a multi-sport star in high school, so you like that from the athletic standpoint. The size question is definitely there. 26th percentile height, 20th percentile weight for tight end. I think he's coming along at the right time for that, though. I mean, we look at Travis Kelce, Hunter Henry, Mark Andrews, Kyle Pitts. All those guys are, bigger and generally better athletes, but they all also played less than 30% of their pass snaps in line last season. Mike Gesicki played 7.4% of his snaps there. So, Trey McBride could just be a slot receiver, and then he looks a little bit better size-wise. I want to see where these guys go. I think Trey McBride at this point, from a fantasy standpoint, he might have started draft season way overrated. Like early best ball drafting had him going tight end 20. So for this coming season, that seemed way too high. Now, though, he's well into tight end 3 range. It's not even clear that he's the top tight end in the class. So I think it's possible that even before we got a draft spot, he might have already gone from like way overrated to slightly underrated.
I'm still anti-rookie tight ends in redraft leagues. I'd rather take a shot on OJ Howard as my tight end 3 than Trey McBride.
For sure. I'm curious to see how far that goes, though, and whether it impacts his rookie draft status. Anybody else here worth tracking to you, Walt, in this tight end class?
Yeah, I mentioned Greg Dulcich. He's a good athlete, good route runner. He's just raw. And then I also mentioned Jelani Woods, who's kind of like on the other end of the spectrum for McBride. Like he's an amazing athlete. He's 6'7", 253, so he doesn't have those size concerns, and he's like super athletic, but he only has 1 year production. He's really raw. Yeah, it's kind of like, there are definitely big flaws with these guys. You have to decide, like, do you want the guy who's smaller and not a great athlete, or do you want the guy who is extremely raw and just may not develop into anything? It's like I said, not a good year to want a tight end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if go ahead.
I was gonna say 100th percentile relative athletic score for Jelani Woods. Like he is a freak, and I was looking into him today actually. He was a high school quarterback moved to tight end his redshirt season at Oklahoma State, as Walter mentioned, didn't do anything at Oklahoma State, had a pretty nice season at Virginia last year. But, that I just think he probably has room to grow considering, he's still pretty inexperienced at tight end.
Yeah, so I think in this class, it's wait, and then take somebody late that has something that you like. Nobody's going to have the entire package. One more guy that I think I'll be watching to see where he goes is Isaiah Likely from Coastal Carolina, 6'5", 245. Could stand to be a little bit thicker, but, taller than Trey McBride. Not fast, 17th percentile speed score. So that's not a killer at tight end, but obviously you'd like a little bit more there. But early breakout in college, strong college dominator, second in the class behind McBride in PFF receiving grade last year. So, I'll be interested to see where he goes and what the outlook is from there. Well, before we head out, Walt, what should people expect to see on and from WalterFootball.com in the coming days and weeks?
Just tons of draft coverage. We have our 6-round mock draft, actually 2 6-round mock drafts on the site. And I actually updated the 2023 NFL mock draft today. We also did something fun today for 420. We did a backward mock draft, so you can see what teams do in a reverse order. Like not so fun for the Lions because they're number 1 in a reverse order, but we had like the Bengals number 2, the Chiefs at 3 and 4. Like what would they do? So that's something fun we do every year. But yeah, during draft week, we're gonna have an updated mock draft every week. Charlie's gonna have some breaking stories as he always does. And during draft weekend, we're going to have draft grades minutes after every pick, and we're going to grade every draft trade. So tons of coverage. If you're into the draft, check that out. And then after the draft, we're going to have updated fantasy rankings.
Nice. Be looking for all those. I'm going to go ahead and assume that the grades are better than what Mel Kiper puts out grade-wise after the draft. But we'll watch and see just to check each of those. He is the creator and head honcho of WalterFootball.com. Walter Cherepinsky, thanks again for joining us today.
Thanks so much, guys.
Absolutely. We are about a week away from the start of the 2022 NFL Draft. Head over to DraftSharks.com now. Read all of those free Dynasty Prospect Scouting reports that we referred to. We'll be posting our pre-draft rookie rankings early next week. Then, of course, we'll blow them up once we get NFL landing spots, and we'll have more rookie rankings out after that. We will also be doing our usual streams from Draft Sharks Draft Weekend away from Rochester next week, so keep an eye out for those. For our guest, Walter Cherepinsky, Jared Smola, and the rest of the Draft Sharks crew, I'm Matt Schauf saying thanks so much for swimming with us.